That's
Time
true.
now for our Rants and Raves of the week, starting with Callie.
Yes, and let's just continue on the time, shall we? So the New York Times earlier this week did an obit about Julian Bond, who is a stalwart in the civil rights movement, a giant, and who died. One would expect they've had a lovely obituary written for many times. That is correct. Unfortunately, that was not right. So the Times public editor, once again, had to speak to one line particularly that raised everybody's ire and should have, and that is the reference to one of Julian Bond's relatives being a mistress to a slave owner. And as one reader said, one can be a mistress, one can be a slave, one cannot be both. For a mistress has the element of consent in what she decides to do, a slave does not. And Margaret Sullivan said, that is absolutely correct.
How did that get in there?
Well, that is not even my only problem.
Oh.
The second part of it is
All right.
There's a lot of assumption in this stated as fact. Once again, anecdotal. So the guy who's writing the obit says Julian Bond dropped out of college and made the point that his dad was a college president. So, of course, that looked bad. He said the civil rights movement provided a good excuse to drop out of college in 1961. Excuse me? He didn't say Julian Bond said. That's stated as fact. So Julian Bond, let me get this straight now, dropped out of college so he could go into a situation where he might lose his life because it provided a good excuse.
Kid, yeah.
Are you kidding? What's with the New York Times? These are people that crafted the portraits of grief so beautifully.
That's awful. All right. Dan Kennedy.
I have a rant and a lukewarm and reluctant defense of Donald Trump.
Okay, you got to make it fast, though. That sounds lengthy.
Earlier this week, Donald Trump went on the Bill O'Reilly show and discussed his plan to take away birthright citizenship for the
per our earlier
babies.
discussion.
Yes, per our earlier discussion. And Bill O'Reilly said, what about the 14th Amendment? He said, well, the courts may be ready to reinterpret that. A perfectly reasonable thing to say for an unreasonable position. The various news organizations could not resist headlines along the theme of Trump says 14th Amendment is unconstitutional. A partial list of offenders, Yahoo Politics, Mother Jones, Politico. By the way, their stories were more accurate than their headlines.
It's always the headline.
Trump is bad enough without having to put words in his mouth.
Justin.
I've got a rave this week for Gene Denby. He's a reporter for NPR, their Code Switch team. He did a very thorough feature this week that looked at how reporters of color, black reporters, deal with reporting on Black Death. Basically, this phenomenon that we've seen in the last year, which has obviously existed long before this, but the trail of stories starting with Ferguson, going to Eric Garner, going to Tamir Rice, how these reporters deal with the trauma that comes from these experiences, from putting yourselves on the front lines of these situations by reporting on stories that sometimes can have echoes to your own life and your own experiences and those of the people around you, and how it's very hard and difficult for people like Wes Lowery of the Washington Post and Trymaine Lee of MSNBC, how these reporters with nothing else have formed their own sort of bonds and fellowships as a support network because of the things that they're dealing with. A fantastic piece that's worth reading, and also raises, I think, larger questions about how news organizations deal with trauma in the newsroom outside of just war reporting, which is where a lot of news organizations think about how you deal with things like PTSD or the other stresses of the job.
John Keller.
All right, brace yourself. I have a rave for Donald Trump, the pajamaless king of the Republican Party. In one of his 13,909 interviews this past week, floating the idea that for the CNN debate, the next big one that's coming up in September, given the historic success of the Fox debate this month, driven by his presence, at least according to him, that they ought to pay $10 million to charities, $1 million to 10 different charities, for the privilege of having him participate, in exchange for which they'll get the monster ratings and they can charge all sorts of big bucks for their commercials. I appreciate the fact that Trump has called out the big media for the way that it is so flagrantly trying to cash in on the Trump phenomenon, and he points out that can work both ways.
We got to leave it there. I'd urge everyone, read Eric Moskowitz's piece from last Sunday's Globe on the last standing West End tenement. Fabulous. That's my rave. That's going to do it for our show. Tell us what you think. Email us, tweet us, or leave us a comment. We are always on at beatthepress.org.